Welcome back, scholars. I am going to continue with chapter 6. We're on unit 2, and this is part 2 of the lecture. Classical conditioning took and will take a large portion of this chapter. Operant conditioning is pretty similar. It's another form of learning where you are really dealing with consequences and to your actions. So you have what we call reinforcement, and you have punishment. We'll talk about each of those moving forward. But again, classical conditioning, just be mindful of what we covered and what we talked about as a review. And you're making associations between different stimuli. You have what we call unconditioned stimulus. We have an unconditioned response. You have a conditioned stimulus and a conditioned response. And the conditioned response and the unconditioned response are the same. The only difference is we have a neutral stimulus, which then is done through association, is connected to the unconditioned stimulus. And while as you do that, the neutral stimulus then being paired with the unconditioned stimulus then becomes the conditioned stimulus. And so if you need to go back to the part 1, you'll see the connection in the process and how you can take a neutral stimulus, something that doesn't initially evoke a response, then to condition someone to then have that neutral stimulus then evoke a response after the conditioning process. Okay, so we're going to move on to operant conditioning, and we will finish up the chapter with operant conditioning. Let me get my timer, and then we'll get started. Okay, so operant conditioning. What is operant conditioning? How do we use it? And why is it important to us? So operant conditioning happens and has happened throughout our entire life. When we talk about operant conditioning, it's again another form of learning, and our voluntary responses, what we do, the voluntary things that we do, our behaviors are controlled by their consequences. And so we've all grown up with parents, guardians, or significant parental figures, and they used reinforcement and punishment to help to control our responses and our behaviors to certain things. Responses followed by favorable consequences are repeated, right? So if I get a great reinforcer, say you're working extremely hard in school, and then your mom takes you out for ice cream, every report card where you have A's and B's or all A's, and just by getting that favorable consequence of getting ice cream after a progress report or a report card, that helps you to continue to study really, really hard and to then be able to perform really well academically. For me, when I was a youngster, I knew that getting good grades would allow me the opportunity to continue to play sports. And so I really, really love playing sports. I love baseball. I love playing football. And I was able to play as long as my grades remained above a B, right? So I got A's and B's, and if they slipped below anything less than a B, then I wouldn't be able to play. And so, by achieving the things in the classroom that I needed to achieve, I was able to play the sports that I loved, and that was something I was really, really passionate about. There are two fundamental principles that come and are associated with operant conditioning. One of them is what we call reinforcement, and the other is punishment. When we talk about reinforcement is a response, a strengthening, because it leads to a rewarding consequence, right? So again, reinforcing something means that you're trying to increase or encourage them to do something again, right? Punishment, on the other hand, is a response is weakened because it leads to a negative consequence. So reinforcement leads to a rewarding consequence. Punishment leads to a negative consequence. Okay? You have 4 different methods of modifying behavior. And again, you have positive and negative, punishment and reinforcement. So now we're going to talk about punishment. We're going to talk about being positive and negative. Reinforcement, again, is rewarding consequence. We're trying to encourage or strengthen a behavior. Punishment is trying to weaken a behavior. And we do that by having negative consequences with whatever we're doing. The positive and the negative, they refer to adding something to influence a behavior, which is positive, and then taking something away to influence behavior, which is negative. So when you put those two things together, positive punishment, positive reinforcement, negative punishment, negative reinforcement, they hint at, again, encouraging a behavior and discouraging behavior, and then adding something to influence a behavior, and then taking something away to, again, influence a behavior. So if you talk about positive punishment is when you're wanting to discourage someone's behavior by adding something to the environment, right? So say that you didn't do really well on an exam. So in an effort to increase or stop you from not studying, they're going to add additional homework so that you will continue to study more, so that you improve your exam scores, right? So they're adding something as a form of punishment so that you'll study more and increase your exam scores. Positive reinforcement is, again, I am using or adding something to the environment, right? So say you do, again, extremely well on the exam and your teacher gives you a lot of praise, and then perhaps she gives you, a pizza party. Everyone who did and passed the exam gets a pizza party. That is what we call a positive reinforcement. She's adding something to influence behavior. She wants you to continue to do well, so she's adding a reward for you doing well. Negative punishment is taking something away. So again, when I was playing football and playing baseball, my mom would take football and baseball away if I got anything less than a B. So I think on my report card, I got a C on my progress report, and my mom, she told me to pack my pads up, and I couldn't play football until I got my grade up to an A. And so that was a negative punishment. She took something away that I really, really wanted and really, really desired, and that made me focus in on the classroom and get the grade that was necessary to play. Negative reinforcement is, again, the opposite of taking something away to increase a behavior. I like to use the example of when you are experiencing some headache, right? If you have a headache, in order to take the headache away, I must take an aspirin. So what happens is you take something away, right? And now I continue to do it, right? So by taking the aspirin, the headache is removed, and I continue the behavior in taking an aspirin when my head hurts, right? So I'm taking something that's really aversive, really unpleasant away. Okay. Skinner, B.F. Skinner, which was a behaviorist, and so we talk about learning, we talk about behaviorism. B.F. Skinner created this box. It was called a Skinner box, and it was a small enclosure in which an animal, it could be a rat, a rabbit, or a cat, makes a specific response while the consequences of the response are controlled, right? So one of the variations of this box is you have a rat in the box, and there's a lever in the box. And every time the rat presses the lever, a food pellet comes out, right? And so every time he presses the lever, another food pellet comes out. And so the rat presses the lever because of the food pellet, right? He's getting what we call positive reinforcement. He's pressing the lever, and you want to increase the behavior, so you provide him with a reward, and they continue to press, right? Another aspect or concept that is associated with the Skinner box is called the reinforcement contingencies. And so the contingencies that we talk about are those circumstances that determine whether the response leads to the presentation of a reinforcer or something else outside of that, right? So maybe you press the lever and you don't get a pellet every time, right? So there's a kind of a variation or a variable in the ratio, and you pressing the button, pressing the lever, and you get a pellet versus not getting a pellet. Or you press the lever and you get shocked because you press it. So if you press the lever and you get shocked, you're probably going to reduce the amount of time or the amount of presses of that lever because you're getting an aversive stimulus when you press the lever. So that's positive punishment, right? Just trying to discourage something by adding something. The key dependent variable here in the operant conditioning is the subject's response rate over time, right? So if every time I press the lever, a piece of food comes out, that's a reward. I press the lever more and more and more and more, that increases the rate of response over time. If I give them an aversive stimulus like a shock every time they press the button or press the lever, then I know I'm going to decrease the response rate over time. And so we're being able to track that, what we call a cumulative recorder. So this is a recorder that, again, it allows us to look at the responses over the course of time, and we look at either an increase in time or a decrease in time, just depending on if it's positive punishment, or excuse me, positive reinforcement or negative reinforcement, or positive punishment and negative punishment. So we're able to see if any of these different variations influences the rate of response over time. Okay. Some of the basic processes in operant conditioning, we'll talk about 6 here. The first one is acquisition. So acquisition in operant conditioning is just the formation of a new response tendency, right? So I press the lever, I get a piece of food. I acquired a new behavior or a new response to, again, receiving that reward. Shaping has a lot to do with training, right? So you want to reinforce, it's a reinforcement of closer and closer approximations of a desired response or behavior, right? So if I'm training my dog to lay down, right, on all fours, I'm going to shape the behavior. So if he dips his head down, I give him a treat. If he dips his head down a little further to the ground, I give him a treat. Once he puts his body fully to the ground, then I give him another treat, right? And so I shape him. He doesn't do every response perfectly each time, but I shape him when he does the right treat, the right behavior, the right movement as an approximation, and eventually then he learns to do down. Okay. Extinction is when reinforcement is stopped, right? So when reinforcement is stopped, you learn not to make the response in a specific context, right? So if my mom gave me ice cream every time I got my report card, progress report when I did really well, and then she stopped giving me ice cream, then I might stop. As a young person, I might stop performing in the classroom because she's no longer reinforcing the behavior. Or if you give the rat in the Skinner box, he presses the lever, pellet comes out, he presses the lever, pellet comes out, and then over time you stop giving him the pellet or reward, he's eventually going to stop pressing the lever because he's no longer getting a reward, and that would be an extinction. Okay. A resistance to extinction means that the organism continues a response after delivery of a responsive reinforcer, has been terminated. This happens a lot in the human realm because humans understand that the reward sometimes is not what we call a primary reinforcer where we're going to get food. Sometimes there are secondary reinforcers that then help us to continue to participate or continue that particular response so that we can continue getting either praise or money or some other intangible thing, like maybe self-confidence that we get from doing a response or doing a behavior that is associated with the reinforcer itself. Okay. There are two other processes that are responsible for in operant conditioning. One of them is what we call stimulus control. Stimulus control is me being able to either generalize among or between different stimuli, or being able to discriminate. Right? We talked about discrimination, being able to determine the difference between one stimulus and the next. Stimuli that precede a response can influence operant behavior. So you see this hot sign, right? I love Krispy Kreme donuts. And so once I see the sign, I tend to respond accordingly to seeing that sign. So what happens is the hot sign comes on. The behavior then is for me to pull over to the side, pull over into the drive-through because I know the hot sign is on. And then the reward I get is the donut, right? So the hot sign is a signal, right, that tells me that I need to go get the reward by going, and the behavior is driving to the drive-through, get the donuts, and I receive my reward, right? The second thing is discriminative stimuli, right? So now I'm able to discriminate between the different signals, right? So these are cues that influence operant behavior by indicating the probable consequences, right, of the response, right? So I know if the hot sign is on, there's a high probability that I am going to get hot donuts, right? There's a high probability that if I drive through the drive-through, there's a high probability that I'm going to get donuts. And if I get those hot donuts, it's going to reinforce me to continue to go when the hot sign is on, right? So there are, again, a discrimination. So if I know the hot sign is off, then I don't go because I understand that I'm not going to get any hot donuts, right? So these reactions to discriminative stimulus are governed by the process of stimulus generalization and stimulus discrimination, like we talked about in classical conditioning, right? The same things occurring even in the operant conditioning case. Okay? So when we talk about reinforcers, there are two types of reinforcers, okay? Two types of reinforcers. You have a primary reinforcer, and then you have what we call a secondary or a conditioned reinforcer. And more often than not, human beings are going to be able to respond to both the primary reinforcer and the secondary reinforcer. Dogs and other animals who can think a little bit better, they may also respond to secondary reinforcers as well. So after you train a dog how to sit, right, they're going to sit without the treat, right? But if you give them praise and continue to praise them as they sit, then they're going to continue because they love praise, just like any human being loves praise as well. Flattery, praise, applause. You continue to do the things that gain you the praise and the applause, okay, and the attention. Many people are attention seekers, so they do things to gain attention. The reinforcers, again, these are not considered reward because the experience of pleasure is an unobservable event that takes place within the organism. So when we talk about those secondary reinforcers, those things that we get, those intangible things that happen on the inside, like self-confidence and self-esteem when you do something really, really well, that is the feeling that you can't really call a reward, but it's an internal and intrinsic reward that we get, okay? Again, the primary reinforcers, these are any event that are inherently reinforcing because they satisfy our biological needs. And when we talked about the hierarchy of needs, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, there are particular needs, right? That foundation, those biological needs that we need, food, shelter, clothing, sexual intimacy, warmth, all of those things, those are those primary reinforcers. And when those things happen, again, that reinforces our behavior. The secondary or the conditioned reinforcers, those events that we acquire, reinforcing qualities by being associated with primary reinforcers. Money in and of itself has no, it does not meet any of our biological needs directly, right? But indirectly, we can buy the things that we need. We can buy shelter, we can buy food, we can buy water. You can, again, influence people to show you affection based on how much money you have. Getting good grades is not inherently a primary reinforcer because grades without any context don't really mean anything. But once you put a place of context to the good grades, then you begin to have that association of a primary reinforcer with the feelings on the inside that you get when you get praised for having good grades. Okay? The other thing that plays a big role in operant conditioning is what we call schedules of reinforcement. And when we talked about the Skinner box tracked the responses and the rate of response over time. And schedules of reinforcement also can influence how quickly the rate of response is, how long, how resistant it is to extinction because of the different schedules of reinforcement. You have what we call extinction. Extinction is when you stop reinforcing and the response then stops. You have intermittent reinforcement. This is sometimes you reinforce, other times you may not reinforce. And then you have continuous reinforcement when, we're talking about here when you continuously give them, right? Every time they do something, you give them something. You give them something, a reward each time they do the behavior. And that can be unrealistic because you're not going to get a reward every time. Every single time you do a response, you may not get a reward, okay? So again, continuous, every instance of a designated response is reinforced with a reward. Intermittent response is reinforced only some of the time. And when it's reinforced some of the time, you have what we call interval, and then you have ratio. Ratio has something to do with instances of behavior and the number of instances of behavior before you're reinforced. Interval has to do with the passage of time before you get a reinforcement. And so we'll talk about fixed versus variable in both of these different concepts. So when you talk about a ratio schedule is, again, referring to the number of responses that take place before you are reinforced. So a fixed ratio is a fixed number of non-reinforced responses before you get your reinforcement. right? So every time you mow a lawn, you're going to get paid $100, right? Or frequent flyer program. So you get a certain number of points every time you fly to a destination. A person who is making a garment, right? They're making a number of dresses in a factory. So they get paid per each 100 dresses they sew, right? So that is every 100 dresses is a ratio. So it's a specific ratio behaviors that they have to perform before they get reinforced. A variable ratio schedule is a variable number of non-reinforced responses. And so you don't know when you're going to get reinforced, but it is kind of on an average based on the number of responses that you do engage in, right? So the slot machine is a great example. You press the lever several times and you don't win anything, right? And then maybe on the 13th time, you press the lever again and you hit, right? But the next time you press the lever, it may not be 13 times, maybe it's 25 times, right? But there's an average reinforcement that happens over the course of time. So that's why individuals keep pressing because of pulling the lever, because they know that they keep pressing, eventually they're going to hit. Buying a lottery tickets the same way, even though the likelihood of you winning a lottery is slim to none. People buy lottery tickets for that very reason, because you don't know if the lottery ticket that you buy, it might be the one. Okay. You also have what we call interval schedules, and those interval schedules are based on time, the passage of time. So a fixed interval schedule is a fixed time interval has elapsed, and after that time has elapsed, then you receive a reinforcement. Maybe you're getting a weekly, bi-weekly, or monthly paycheck. So every 2 weeks you get a paycheck, right? Every month you get a paycheck. Every 6 months you get a dental exam. So again, fixed time, and after that time has elapsed, then you have a response or a reinforcement. Then the second one is the second of interval schedules is variable interval. And variable interval, this is a schedule where the interval length varies around a predetermined average, right? So when you have a pop quiz in a class, this is really just based on your professor, right? You don't know when you're going to have the exam. So say the response that they want to get out of you is you reading your textbook and studying the material more often and more frequently, right? So they do pop quizzes so that you have to stay ready. You have to continue to read, you have to engage in the materials so that when you get that pop quiz, you do extremely well. If you do not engage in studying and reading and doing those things necessary to stay abreast in class, then you won't do so well in the pop quiz. Same thing with a surprise visit from a health inspector or any other person, right? You want to make sure that your restaurant is up to par and up to code, so that if there is a surprise visit, then you don't have to worry about getting dinged by the health inspector, right? So that's really, really important, that variable interval passage of time is around some predetermined average, but it's not a direct and fixed passage of time. So here are some examples, for the fixed interval. I know every day I get off at 5:00 p.m. So I'm always going to be looking at the clock, looking at the time to see if it's getting close to quitting time, right? Surfing is one where, kind of similar to fishing, you may not catch a good wave every time, right? But you might catch one. Who knows? And that's why people love surfing, right? That's why people love surfing. Variable interval ones where the response rate is extremely high, and it's going to be very, very resistant to extinction because you don't know when it's going to hit. So you keep pulling and you keep waiting in an effort to see if you can, again, get the reward that you want. Ratio and interval, fixed ratio interval, those are the ones that are really, they're lower, they have a lower prevalence to extinction, right? So if you stop rewarding them, then they might stop, right? They might stop. And so you have to be really mindful of that. If you stop paying me, I'm probably not going to go to work because I'm not going to work for free, right? So those, the extinction might be a little higher for those because the reinforcement has to be paid or given in a particular time. Okay. So here's what I was speaking on when we talked about the Skinner model, the Skinner box. These are kind of ticks based on the different variations of the different schedules. right? So variable schedules are categorically less predictable, so they tend to resist extinction and encourage continued behavior, right? So if you see all the variable interval, it's really, really slow, steady rate, and it's slow and steady because it's an interval, it's based on time, right? And you see there's a passage of time that might be shorter here or longer here, and then you get a reward. And then after a point, you move on for another passage of time, then you get a reward. And here's a shorter passage of time, and then you get a reward, and you keep going. And these shorter intervals generate higher rates overall, right? So here's a very, very short interval where they received a reward. It was a very, very short time, and then they received another one. And so they keep going, they keep performing the task because they know that the reinforcement is coming eventually. Again, when we talk about variable schedules, again, it's very, very continuous, highly resistant to extinction. Um, the rate of response and cumulative response is very, very steep because you're going to continue to press the lever and continue to press the lever and continue to press the lever in order to get a response. So look at this one. So the tick right here, you got a reinforcer, and then shortly after a couple responses, you get another one. And then you press the lever several times, and then you hit again. And then there's a short time where you don't, and then you hit again. So again, the higher ratios generate higher ratios of response rates. And so again, very, very high, steady rate without pauses, and you just keep pressing, you keep pressing. Ratio schedules are very, very different because they elicit higher response rates than interval schedules, but because of their predictability. Right? So the ratios, there's predictability here. So you increase your response rate over the course of time. It's really, really high. But again, there is some predictability in it. So I know it's coming. So let me press these levers so I can get it. The pauses that you see here, right? So the long pause after reinforcement yields what we call a scalping effect. So every time a paycheck is hit, right? I pause for a little bit, my responses begin to die, and then I increase the responses again as I, again, know that the interval of the time is approaching again. And then I dip a little bit, my energy is a little low, and then I start to increase my responses over the course of time again, right? And it scalps. Same thing with the fixed ratio. It does scallop a bit. It's a shorter pause ratio, a shorter pause after reinforcement, but there is a short pause. You see the up here, and then it pauses a little bit, and then up a little bit, and then it pauses to the right a little bit. So those are short pauses after you get the reinforcement because you know that they're coming in a fixed interval or fixed ratio. Okay, and here is just a summary of the things that we talked about, and the comparisons of the schedules of reinforcement. You can pause it to go through each of these if you need a little more explanation. Okay, here's just a reinforcement, a reinforcement of the reinforcement. So positive versus negative reinforcement. Again, positive reinforcement recurs when response is strengthened because it's followed by a presentation of rewarding stimulus, and negative reinforcement is response is strengthened when you follow by removal of an aversive stimulus, an unpleasant stimulus. So for this one, I give you $1 each time you get an A. For this one, you take an aspirin every time you have a headache because the aspirin removes the aversive or the unpleasant stimulus. Another negative reinforcement, some of our classrooms are really, really cold. And so you put on your jacket every time you come into the classroom, and that removes the aversive unpleasant stimulus because it's removing the coolness that you feel, right? So again, you put on the jacket, and so each time you put on the jacket, you remove the aversive and unpleasant stimulus. So again, negative reinforcement is still a reinforcement because it is increasing or strengthening the behavior. So again, what is an aversive stimulus? Right, an aversive stimulus is something that we don't want to happen, right? So if in a positive reinforcement, a response leads to the presentation of a rewarding stimulus. So I press the button here, right? Press the lever. The rewarding stimulus presented, food is delivered, right? So I want to continue to do that, right? For this one, a negative reinforcement is a response that leads to the removal of an aversive stimulus, right? So I'm getting shocked right here. I'm getting hit right here. I'm getting hit right here. So I want to continue to do that, right? For this one, a negative reinforcement is a response that leads to the removal of an aversive stimulus, right? So I'm getting shocked right here. I'm getting hit right here. I'm getting hit right here. So I want to continue to do that, right? For this one, a negative reinforcement is a response that leads to the removal of an aversive stimulus, right? So I'm getting shocked, I'm getting shocked, I'm getting shocked. And in order not to get shocked, I press a lever and the aversive stimulus is removed, so I turn the shock off, right? So in this particular example, he's being shocked at his feet, so he presses the lever to remove the aversive, right? So in this example, the effective behavior is the same. You're going to the tendency to, again, press the lever is going to increase because you want the food delivered or rewarding stimulus. And you're going to increase the pressing of the lever for this one as well because you want to stop the shocking of your feet, right? So the same effect on behavior, just different ways in reaching the positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement. Okay. Escape learning is something that we do all the time, right? So an organism acquires a response that decreases or ends some aversive stimulation, right? So we do this all the time. If we're in a room and we hear the fire alarm go off, right? Really, really loud, really, really annoying. And so we leave the room because the fire alarm has sounded, right? We remove ourselves from the environment, and that leads to the removal of whatever it is. It could be a shock, it could be a loud noise, and we strengthen through negative reinforcement. So again, every time I hear a fire alarm go off, it's really, really annoying. I leave the room so that I don't have to worry about hearing the loud noise, right? So what happens when you can't escape though? What happens when you can't escape? Learned helplessness occurs when an organism has been exposed to an inescapable aversive event or stimulus. So what if I got locked in the room? The door's automatically locked, and I'm sitting in here, and the sound of the alarm is just deafening, right? I try to open the door. I'm trying to get out. And then I just sit down and cover my ears, right? Sit down and cover my ears and stop trying to get out because I'm locked in. So I sit down, I cover my ears. That is what we call learned helplessness, right? So I just stop trying to get out because I can't get out. And the aversive stimulus is still going, right? But I can't leave, right? That's what happens when you chain a dog up and they don't want to be chained up, right? So they're whining and trying to get out and trying to get out and trying to get out. And then eventually they just submit, right? They stop trying to get out, get away, and they submit to just being locked up, right? Avoidance learning is very, very similar to what we call escape learning. But this happens when an organism acquires a response that prevents some aversive stimulus from occurring. So here's an example, right? I hate sitting in traffic. I'm really impatient. So whenever I'm sitting in traffic, I have to turn on some peaceful music, or because I get really, really high anxiety when I sit in traffic for long periods of time. So I try my best to leave at a certain point and try to avoid different routes so that I don't have to sit in traffic. And avoidance learning is I went down one road before. I see a particular time of day that this is not the right road to go down. So I'm going to wait a little bit, let the traffic die down a little bit, and then I'll go down the road, or I'll just find an alternate route so that I don't have to go down the same road. And that's avoiding something. And I've learned because of the experiences that I've had before. So I avoid something to, again, avoid the aversive stimulus from occurring. Punishment, we talked about positive and negative punishment. Punishment, again, is an event, again, following a response that weakens the tendency to make that response, okay? So typically, when we talk about involving presentation of an aversive stimulus, we're talking about, and again, we can talk about positive punishment and negative punishment, but in this case, we're talking about negative reinforcement and punishment itself, right? So what happens? You're getting shocked in your feet, you're getting shocked, you press a lever to turn the shock off, the tendency to press a lever increases, right? For this one, you press a lever and the aversive stimulus is presented or a shock is turned on, so you stop pressing the lever. So in this case, reinforcement, you're increasing. Punishment, you're decreasing because you turn the shock on. And so now you stop pressing the lever because you know that the shock will turn on, right? So again, punishment can also mean removal of a rewarding stimulus, right? So we talk about negative punishment. So this right here is positive punishment, right? Negative punishment is you get in trouble at school, your mom, she takes your cell phone away, or you get in trouble in school and you're no longer able to go to the dance that you wanted to go to, or the movies, or whatever it is. She's taking away a rewarding stimulus, and so now let me stop getting in trouble so I can do some of the things that I want to do. Okay. Punishment and aggressiveness, and we're looking at the correlation between the two. There's been a lot of research that has shown that correlation does not, again, it does not establish causation, right? So reliance on just physical punishment causes children to be more aggressive, and they can, right? But it doesn't necessarily mean that that's the cause of why children are more aggressive. Highly aggressive children could and may cause their parents to depend heavily on physical punishment. Those who just are mischievous, those who are really, really high strung and really, really active, they might cause their parents to have to use more physical punishment or heavily on physical punishment. But it does not necessarily mean that's the case. Parents also could pass genetic tendencies for aggressiveness. They could model aggressiveness behavior and rely on heavy use of physical punishment. So there is a mixture, right, where there's some kind of mediating things that are happening where punishment is really highly relied upon. You might have aggressive children, but then it might be a two-way street, right? And then the aggressive parental temperament. So parents just might be more aggressive themselves, and if they have a more aggressive temperament, then they're probably going to spank their children more often than if they did not. So I don't really have an aggressive temperament. I don't really believe that you have to whoop a child. There might be times where you need to, but oftentimes, you maybe can take something away from the child, and that could give and have the same effect, right? So it's a give and take, and you have to be mindful of your children, and you have to be mindful of yourself, right? So that's why it's always important when you have to discipline a child after you've cooled down from whatever they've done. If they've broken a vase in the house or broken a window, then hey, let's take a deep breath, and then let's talk to them about how we're going to punish them. You don't want to be angry as you're whooping your child, because it could get again be heavily on physical punishment, which could then be it could be detrimental. Could be detrimental. Okay. All right. So we talked about this. What is the difference between punishment and negative reinforcement? Reinforcement increases the behavior. Punishment decreases the behavior. And it says, when would punishment be a more effective outcome? When would negative reinforcement be a better choice? Punishment just depends on the severity of what's happening, right? You might not need to punish someone because, again, you could take something away from them and that might do the trick, right? Punishment sometimes is warranted because of the severity, but sometimes it's not. Negative reinforcement, if I wanted to increase a behavior, taking something away from someone to increase their behavior is sometimes warranted, right? So for for a child, right, they don't like taking medicine, but you know that if they take this medicine, that their stomach ache will go away, right? Robitussin doesn't taste right, so Robitussin can help with the cold, but they don't really like the taste of it. So you give them the taste of it, they feel better, and they might take it more often because they know that after taking the Robitussin, they feel better. Okay. So there are some other changes in the way we study conditioning. We'll talk about those. We'll talk about observational learning. We'll talk about latent learning and other ways that we're able to learn even without going through the processes of classical and operant conditioning. Okay, so let's talk about the constraints, the biological constraints on conditioning. There are some limits to kind of the generality of conditioning principles. So what about when we talk about conditioned taste aversion, right? There's a natural selection of favors organisms that quickly learn what not to eat. So when our ancestors were looking for and hunting and gathering for food, they knew that there are particular berries and particular plants and vegetable life that they should not eat because there was a certain taste that did not sit well with their stomachs, and it may have been poisonous. Or they learned that they got ill from eating berries from that bush, and so now they don't eat from that bush because someone was severely ill from eating certain things. That's natural selection. Again, have a taster version of things that are bitter, that are really, really sour, because again, it gives us the idea that it might not be safe. Again, evolution kind of has programmed us to learn that certain types of associations are, again, more easily than other types, right? So we make these associations, and that's why phobias are really, really important, because in our ancestors have to deal with it. Snakes, spiders, bats, heights, all of those things are kind of common and genuine threats to our ancient ancestors. And so that's why perhaps we have those same similar fears. They might be irrational now, but at that point in time back then, those things were dangerous. Those animals were dangerous. And so we have to be mindful that heights, any land dwelling animal is probably going to be afraid of heights, because if you don't know how to fly, right, why would you go up at a particular height, right? Why would you jump out of a plane without a parachute, right? Because you don't know. I mean, you can't fly, right? So heights, again, being afraid of heights and those phobias, again, they're more common because they were once genuine threats to our ancient ancestors. And then preparedness, we are just we have a predisposition to be conditioned in certain ways and not others. So, we learn certain things a lot faster than we do other things, right? So that's why, I'm not afraid of, SUVs, right? Because they're not inherently dangerous to me, but I might be more afraid of something else because of the inherent fear of my ancestors having to deal with it. Okay. Latent learning is another way that we learn, kind of involuntarily. Latent learning is not always apparent from behavior when it occurs, but when it happens, we understand that we, like walking around on campus, right? Inherently, like we don't really take into the account that we're bringing and taking in information, but we are doing what we call a latent learning, right? We are building what we call a cognitive or a spatial map, and we're able to see things on campus now because we've been familiarizing ourselves with the landscape on campus. So I know how to get home. From here, I can kind of build a cognitive map in my mind because I've driven it so often. I know what other roads I could take to get there. I know the main roads. I know a lot of things based on my previous experiences, right? So learning can occur without any reinforcement. And findings suggested that when you put a maze, a rat in a maze, the rats who displayed latent learning formed what we call a cognitive map of the maze, right? So they created what we call a mental representation of the spatial layout. You put them in, they went through, they hit a dead end here, so they went to the next, and they were able to find their way out of the maze. But when you put them back in the second time, or the third time, fourth time, they were able to, again, increase their time in getting out of the maze because they had started to build what we call a latent learning or a cognitive map of that particular maze. So over the course of time, you build these cognitive maps without any reinforcement, right? It's just a map that kind of naturally happens as we are engaging in our environments. Okay. So some other things that do occur, right, is what we call signal relations, right? And this gives us what we call a predictive value of a conditioned stimulus and its factor governing classical conditioning, right? So there are some signals that are stronger than others, right? And classical conditioning may involve some information processing rather than reflexive responding. So when we go back to the hot sign, right? I turn the hot sign on, I know that there's an association that was made with that, right? So that I know eventually I can get some hot donuts and that's the reward, right? So that conditioned stimulus can then serve as what was once a neutral stimulus that didn't have it didn't invoke any response whatsoever, right? So there's some predictive value in that conditioned stimulus. And so we predict that something is going to happen based on the associations that we make. And we have to use our cognition to make that happen. So it may not just be a reflexive thing that just happens involuntarily. There is a cognitive piece that happens when we process classical conditioning process. The response outcome relationship, again, this highlights the role of cognitive processes and conditioning, right? So when we talked about the hot sign for the donuts, again, it refers back to that, right? You turn the hot sign on. I know that the end goal, the end outcome is I'm going to get donuts, right? But I have to go drive over to get the donuts, but there's a signal, there's a cue. I use that cue to then get the reward that I want in the end. Okay. One other thing that we talk about is recognizing the process in conditioning. So superstitious behaviors could be established through non-contingent reinforcement, right? One time we wear what we deem as our lucky shirt, right? We uh, we play in a game, or we're playing. We take every test we take, we put our lucky shirt on, and we seem to be doing extremely well on in exams when we put on our lucky shirt. But then again, it occurs when the response is accidentally strengthened by a reinforcement that follows it. So what happens is you put on what you think your lucky shirt is. You put on the lucky shirt, you do really well on the exam, and then you're like, man, I need to wear this shirt again because, man, this is great. This is going to help me to do really well on all my exams. What happens then is you wear that shirt one time, you don't study the night before because you think it's your lucky shirt and you're going to do well regardless, and then you don't do well. That superstition that's debunked, right? That's a myth, right? So any accidental reinforcements may sometimes contribute to these superstitions, but again, we have to be mindful that superstitions inherently don't really matter because everything has a response, everything has a consequence. So preparing for the exam is going to make your chances of doing extremely well higher than just wearing any shirt. There has to be something else that you do and other consequences that take place for something else to occur. Okay. And so we'll have a conversation about this in class, but so many people are superstitious. You sit in a particular way in class, or your morning routine has to be done a certain way for you feel good about the day that you're embarking upon. Or, you have to click the lights on several times before you do so. There are superstitions. You don't walk under ladders because there's bad luck. You break a mirror. All of those things happen every day, and sometimes there is kind of an accidental reinforcement that happens, but it doesn't necessarily mean you're going to have bad luck for 7 years. That's not something that actually happens. So observational learning happens all the time, right? So is imitation really the sincerest form of flattery, right? When we talk about observational learning, there's an imitation piece that has to happen, right? We imitate or we observe our family, we observe our mother and father, and we act like them in certain ways because of what we've observed them do or not do, and their preferences and what they prefer and not prefer, right? So consider this example here, right? It says Claire's 9-year-old son, Jay, was getting into trouble at school and was defiant at home. Claire feared that Jay would end up like her brothers, 2 of whom were in prison. One day, after yet another bad day at school and another negative note from the teacher, Claire, at her wits' end, beat her son with a belt to get him to behave. Later that night, as she put her children to bed, Claire witnessed her 4-year-old daughter, Anna, take a belt to her teddy bear and whip it. Claire was horrified, realizing that Anna was imitating her mother. It was then that Claire knew she wanted to discipline her children in a different manner. This is and happens more often than we know. Our young people, our younger sister, our younger brother, our children imitate and see things that we do. They are soaking things up like a sponge, and children do it more often than anyone. But as adults, we continue to do the same thing. If you go into a restaurant for the first time and you're unfamiliar with the ordering process, you're going to go in and observe what's happening in the restaurant before you make a selection, right? So you observe a few people go through and you're like, okay, yeah, maybe I need to order it this way. Or, sometimes people go up to the door and the door is locked, and then another person goes up and the door is locked. So I sit there like, okay, the door is locked. I observed them go up to the door, try to pull the door, and it was locked. So now I know that the door is locked. In fact, so I'm not going to get out of my car to the door because I observed. It's called observational learning, that the door is in fact locked after a few people went up and did not get a chance to enter the door. Okay. I'll play this during class. It's a really, really great example of observational learning. Our children play a big role in and observe everything that we do. And so we have to be mindful of what we do, what we say around them, because they do repeat things that they hear. And we see TikToks, we see videos on YouTube all the time where a young person is imitating something that they heard or saw from somebody that they've been around in their social environment. Okay. So there are four key processes and basic processes to observational learning that occur when an organism kind of responds to a model. And a model is something or someone that you watch to see what's happening, what they do. They're a model. They're modeling something for you so that you then learn from the model. And the key processes are attention. So you must be paying attention to another person's behavior in order to acquire the skill, the knowledge, the behavior, whatever it is you're trying to obtain. In order to retain something, you must store it as a mental representation of what you have seen in memory. And we'll talk about memory here next. But learning and memory go hand in hand. You got to have good memory. You got to be able to retain it. You have to be able to retrieve it. And then once you get it in and you're able to retrieve it, then you can what we call reproduce it. So you have to be able to reproduce the response or the behavior. And then you have to be motivated, right? You will only reproduce an observed response if you are motivated to do so, right? So what is the payoff for me? What is the what motivation do I get? What reward do I get from learning this task, learning this behavior? How will it help me in the long run? When individuals, and I'm really jealous of individuals who can learn a dance extremely quickly, they look at something, they're paying attention to it, they're really observing all the different intricacies of this particular dance, they retain it in their mental memory, they go through the whole dance, they turn and restart the song over, and the person sitting there watching that has the talent, they reproduce it, and it's flawless, like they had been doing it all along. Right, that is a particular skill, but the number one thing that they had to do, they had to pay attention to it, had to pay attention to it, and then they had to retain it in order to reproduce it after they played the song back. Okay. One other thing that is discussed when we talk about observational learning, and we talk about that all the time because people are influenced by what they see, what they hear, the conversations they have. And Albert Bandura, he's a psychologist, he found that observational learning plays an important role in regulating our behavior, right? So you need a good model in order to kind of get you to do the right things, right? You have a good model and you have a good model, you grow up in a great environment and you're going to model some more positive and pro-social behaviors versus not having good models and you do things that won't help you be successful, right? It says children were more aggressive after watching violent videos. And there's a study that was done where they had young people watching in another room and they watched as an adult. They called it a Bobo doll. And the adult was beating up the Bobo doll, hitting it with different objects, and was really punishing this Bobo doll. And they, again, allowed the young people to view it. And then they gave the young people a chance to interact with the Bobo doll. It's just an inflatable doll. It's not really harming anybody. But those same children that saw the model beating up on the Bobo doll, they also beat up on the Bobo doll because they observed that, again, model. And it's somebody they didn't even know. They observed the model beating up on the Bobo doll, and they just mimicked and imitated the aggression that they saw. Okay, but decades of research have agreed that media violence has fostered an increase in aggression. Right, it does. Media violence desensitizes people to the effects of aggression in the real world. I like to use the example of police brutality. Right, we have been, in a way, desensitized to the effects of police brutality because we see it so often. Some of the things that we watch on television and see on the news, we see it so often. And oftentimes, for me, this is just a personal testimony. When I watch things on TV, especially dealing with police brutality, it sometimes feels like I'm watching a movie, right? And I'm extremely desensitized to it. And then the next news story comes on and it's gone, right? The desensitization kind of mute those reactions to the real violence that happened. And so we have to be mindful about the experiences that we've had and what happens. Because again, when we are desensitized, then the aggression and the violence can then be pushed off into other parts of our life, and we have to be really mindful. It says long-term results do show that the more violence children watch on TV, the more aggressive they tend to be at home and at school. To bring some levity to the situation, when WCW, WWF was really, really popular back when I was in elementary and middle school, we would watch those things on TV the night before, and the day after, you would see people get DDT'd and Stone Cold Stunnered and power bombed, and we would do all the moves. All the boys would just go crazy. We had this. This was funny, but when we would have a watch out, right? So our teacher would leave when we were in band. Our teacher would leave, and we would have somebody watching out for us. And when the teacher would leave, it would be a royal rumble in the band room. We'd be hitting people with chairs and hitting people with music stands and jumping off the top rope, off the piano. It was absolutely crazy. And again, children watch those things, and when you watch them, it does make you more aggressive. And it was the case for us when watching WCW and World Wrestling Federation. So it does happen, and we have to be mindful of that, what we watch, what we view, what we consume, because those things do affect our behavior. They affect our mindset. And again, if our mindset is affected, then subsequently our behaviors and our responses to things will also be affected as well. All right, so we're going to end on that. There are some, chapters, themes, and I guess I'll finish on these chapter themes. But when we talk about behavior and the influence of behavior, our heredity and our environment both play a key role and an important role in how we learn, what we learn in our behavior in the long run. And many theorists believe that all aspects of behavior have some environmental determinants. And so we are able to model things, we see them, we talk about observational learning, and then we talk about just our biological constraints, right? So conditioned taste aversion and our phobias that we get when, with our fear of heights or our fear of snakes, even when we didn't have a bad experience with snakes, right? We just have an aversion to certain things, and that's biological. That's something that's been handed down from generation to generation. When we talk about the psychological evolution with the socio-historical context, things that happen in our world now are influenced by what's going on now, right? So positive reinforcement has influenced the patterns of discipline in American society. So many people no longer do physical or corporal punishment because of the effects that have occurred because of that, right? They're showing that it's not as effective as it was believed to have been effective. And research on operant conditioning has affected, the business world. We talk about, the advertising and, the increased emphasis on positive reinforcement. All of those things help to influence everything that we do. And, positive reinforcement, we're trying to get students to perform in the classroom. We're trying to reduce the academic achievement gap between lower income students and their more affluent peers. We want to increase their academic performance by giving them positive reinforcement, giving them rewards, giving them incentives to continue to study and do things necessary to decrease that gap in achievement. Okay. So we'll end there. I hope, again, you all got a lot out of this chapter. This is part 2 of chapter 6, learning. And we'll talk about human memory in chapter 7, and then move into cognition and intelligence in chapter 8. Again, thank you all for watching, and we will see you all soon.